Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys stopping by, taking a look at my video here. So I have Jan Nepomniachtchi versus Anish Giri, and this is from the 2021 Magnus Carlsen Invitational, part of the Champions Chess Tour. This is the last game they played. As most of you guys probably already know, Anish Giri did win that tournament, but this is one of the games from that. So for all my people from the Philippines, magandang umaga, or maayong buntag, kamusta, a king maga kaibigan, or a king akong maga higala. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Anybody who's coming from Russia, privyet to you. Spasibo for coming and taking a look at my video. Anybody who is from the Netherlands, I will say hello. And thank you for coming by and taking a look at my video here. Appreciate it very much. If you guys are ready, let's take a look, see what we got. Make sure the volume is up. Yeah, there we go. Cool. All right, so we got B3, we got D5, bishop to B2. So we have the Nimzowitsch-Larsen classical variation opening. You know, it's just a fee and kettle, a way to fee and kettle the bishop here. As a lot of you guys know, there's two main schools of thought. There's the classical school, which is like the old school, like Chigarin, stuff like that. Like, you know, they pretty much believe that you should occupy the center with pawns. And they didn't really too much believe in fee and kettle type stuff, which a lot of players, they do and they think about now. You know, it's part of a lot of people's openings and stuff to play, you know, fee and kettle type situations, especially like King's Indian stuff or stuff like that on the king side here. Hence King's Indian, Queen's Indian, stuff like that. So it's definitely a part of modern play, but it was very revolutionary back in the early 1900s when people started putting their bishops on the diagonals. So we have that here, the Nimzowitsch-Larsen. So we got bishop f5, we got d3, we have c5, which, as crazy as it sounds, at move 3, we have the novelty of the game. I was really actually very shocked because this is actually one of the strongest ways to play against the fee and kettle on the queen side. You know, you're just trying to establish as huge of a pawn center as you can. So it just kind of seems pretty natural to play this way. So if we just make a couple more moves, knight comes to d2, we see knight to f6, we see g3, knight to c6, we got bishop to g2, and we have e5. So as you can see, you know, white has adopted the double fee and kettle Hikaru type situations. But you know, black has really established like the ideal pawn center, and they have their bishop out, they have their knights both out. So black is doing very, very well at trying to, you know, make sure that they take the position completely over. So it's very, very strong play by Anish Giri here with this. Right, so we see e4 by white, trying to get their own little space in the center. Pawn takes e4, pawn takes e4, and we have bishop back to e6. We got knight g to f3. We got queen to c7. We have castles by white. We have bishop to e7 by black. And we have knight to c4. Now, there's something I'm going to mention here. I'm going to have you stop the video in the future. I'll let you know when that happens. But knight to c4 is actually a mistake. It allows black basically to capture here and damage their pawn structure. Yes, they've given up a bishop for the knight, but they've given white a lot of problems. They've, you know, isolated and doubled these pawns here. They've isolated this pawn. So now, unfortunately, white has to basically babysit all of these weaknesses and stuff like that. So usually when you're giving up a bishop for a knight, these are the types of things that you want to get as compensation for you doing that, because usually bishops can be stronger than knights, especially when the position is open, but it's not always a guarantee. Sometimes knights are better than bishops. It just depends on the situation. But this is definitely something that was really good for black. But for some reason, Anish Giri did not go into that. He actually played his rook to d8. Now, this is the part in the video, if you want to go ahead and stop the video and see what white should play here. What's the strongest move for white in this position? And we'll get back with you. All right, cool. So based on everything that I just said, you know, there's this pawn that at the moment is undefended. You know, they're putting a lot of pressure on this e5 pawn, yes, by all of this. But as of kind of the moment, the pawn on e4 is undefended. And like I said, we do have that issue that I mentioned a second ago with this knight being captured, right? So if you decided on the move queen to e2, you would be absolutely correct. Queen not only takes care of, you know, protecting this knight, but it also protects this pawn. So if we had something, you know, if we had something like bishop takes c4, you know, we'd see queen taking c4. And as you can see, the structure is not bad for white in this particular situation. Now, after queen to e2, if you did see something like knight to d4, you're not worried about that because you can take here with bishop takes d4. And then after the pawn takes d4, you actually get a pawn out of the situation. So yes, you've given up a bishop, but you've gotten a pawn, and that's pretty legitimate compensation. So going back to what we had after we had rook to d8, we actually had queen to b1. Now, I'm going to be completely honest. I'm not really sure what queen to b1 is doing. You know, you still have this as an issue, and you also have this as an issue. So I don't know if there's some type of trap or something he was trying to set. You know, Anish Giri says he's not feeling it. So he goes ahead and he takes the bishop here, or takes the knight here with bishop takes c4. And then the pawn takes on c4. You have castles by black and rook to e1, and that is now protecting that pawn. But as I said before, you know, white has a lot of weaknesses. They have these double pawns here, which aren't moving anywhere anytime soon, and this isolated pawn. So white has a very, very defensive position. And as you can see, now they only have two, because the knight was removed, now they only have two attackers of this e5 pawn. So it is legitimately defended. And if you ever need to, you can move the bishop here and move a rook over, and you're just over defending your position. So black is doing really, really good here. So the knight comes to d7. We see bishop to f1, and then we see knight to d4. And then we see knight to d2. You know, another possibility was bishop takes on d4, and then pawn takes d4. But I mean, the position is pretty much going to be the same thing either way. After knight to d2, we see bishop to g5, and what you're going to start to see black doing right now is black is going to start with every single move they make. They're going to start picking on every single one of white's weaknesses. So this knight being undefended is a weakness. These pawns being doubled is a weakness. This isolated pawn is a weakness. So you'll see black very effectively start to pick on all of these different weaknesses that white has. So the bishop takes on d4, but we have a nice intermezzo Zwischenzug move. Bishop takes d2, and then forces the rook to d1. We see pawn takes d4, rook takes d2, you know, you have this nice pawn chain here for black, you do have a very, very weak pawn here that after maybe knight to b6 and maybe rook to c8, you're going to be able to try to exploit. And of course, you cannot push it because it's just going to be just completely undefendable. So we do see knight to c5. The bishop comes to d3. We see rook to d6. We see rook to e2. We have rook to a6. We see queen to c1, rook to a4, and we have queen to g5. Now, queen to g5 is not really doing much. I mean, you don't have a dark squared bishop, so you don't have any weaknesses here. You don't really have any ways for the rooks to swing over and really create any threats. And this bishop basically is a tall pawn. It's connected and trying to protect this pawn, and it's just like pretty much defending these pawns. So it doesn't really have the type of scope that you want a bishop to have. And so we see f6. Black is just like, hey, I'm just going to knock your queen away. So the queen comes to h5 with possible dreams at some point and maybe throwing some type of checkmate possibility on h7. But Anish Giri, you know, he's aware of all of this. So he's not letting that slide. So we see rook to a3. We see rook to d2. And we see queen to a5. And like I was telling you guys before, every single move that black is making, other than defending the position that he has, is going to attack weaknesses. So if we just back up here, we see queen going to h5. We see rook to a3, and that is placing a direct threat of taking this bishop off. And then after the pawn takes, the rook takes. And then after the rook defends on d2, we see queen to a5, which places a threat on not only this pawn, but it places a threat on this undefended rook. So as you can see, you know, Anish Giri is just picking on every single weakness that Jan Nepomniachtchi actually has in his position. So we see rook down to d1, rook d to d1. And then, you know, something has to give. So the rook takes on a2. We see rook a to b1. Queen back to c7. The queen has fulfilled its duties over there on the queen side. So he's centralizing itself more. So the rook comes to f1. And like I said before, you know, we have dreams of maybe the pawn pushing. And then the pawn taking, the pawn pushing. And then maybe we have like some type of, you know, check situation here, which, you know, black is not going to fall for. Bam. That. It's kind of complicated. The rook comes back to a5, but just to demonstrate what I was showing you, if you did push f4, maybe take here, push that here. If just white falls asleep or black falls asleep, you have check here, moving the king over. It's a checkmate type of pattern that you see. You know, Anish Giri obviously is not going for that. So we see rook to a5. The queen comes to g4. We see rook to a3, and then we see f4. Pawn takes f4, pawn takes f4, and then now we see knight taking d3, pawn taking d3, and then we have rook taking d3. And as you can see, if we just do a material count, black is up 2 entire pawns. They have 6 pawns to white's 4 pawns, so it's looking pretty dismal for white. You know, if you get into an endgame where the queens are traded and you have a rook endgame, these are usually wins. They're not always wins, but generally when you're up 2 pawns, it's a lot easier to win a rook endgame than for it to just be 1 pawn. So the pawn comes to e5. We see rook to e3, queen to g2. And we're trying to be slick here because if black falls asleep and just maybe takes here or something like that, if we see something like this, we're going to be seeing a rook taking here, attacking the queen. And the problem for the queen now is that they cannot defend a checkmate in 1. So, you know, white is hoping that he can kind of sneak that in there. But Anish Giri is too smart for that. He said, I'm not dealing with none of that. So queen comes to c6. We see queen to d5 with check. The queen takes on d5. Pawn takes d5. We see pawn takes e5. Rook takes b7. Pawn takes f4. And now you see that black, not only are they up 3 pawns, but they do have a completely passed pawn on d4 and also a very dangerous pawn on f4. So the rook comes to c1. We see f3. King comes to f2, trying to see if we can stop that pawn. The rook comes to e2 with check. The king comes down to g1, forced, because you can't come to g1 because you're going to be seeing check. The rook comes to e5. We see rook c to c7. The rook comes to g5, and it's just beautiful because it's protecting. Because usually when you have these 2 pigs on the 7th, it's very, very deadly. But if you have an active rook, you can defend against these threats. So we see h4. Rook comes to g4. We got king to f2. We got rook to g2. King coming to f1. We have f2. And it is in this position that Jan Nepomniachtchi does resign the game. And literally you resign because there is no way to stop rook to g1. And then after rook comes to g1, the king is going to be forced to e2. And then you're going to be taking here. So if we see something, you know, let's say we just push the pawn real quick, you know, just to make a move. Rook comes to g1, king comes over, and you're having this here. I mean, if you even try to defend this, you know, knowing that the rook is going to be coming, you come up, you know, you're going to be taken here with check. You're going to have to trade, and then you're just going to be down an entire rook. And that's just not anything you can really do anything about. So, like I said, in lieu of that, you know, he went ahead and resigned. So, all of my people from the Philippines, Maraming Salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. Masaya akong makita kang muli. Appreciate you guys stopping by. Mabuhay to you. Almasal tayo. I already ate my breakfast, but yours is coming up pretty soon. It's past midnight there. So I appreciate you guys coming by very much. You know, people from Russia, spasibo to you. Appreciate you guys taking a look at my video. And all my people from the Netherlands who speak Dutch, thank you. Appreciate you guys coming by and taking a look at my video very much. And I will see you guys next time. All right.